The xenobiology labs aboard New Horizon hummed with the kind of productive tension that marked humanity's first serious attempt at cooperative research with an alien species whose approach to science operated according to principles that challenged everything human academia thought it understood about systematic inquiry. Dr. James Chen adjusted his holographic displays for the third time in 10 minutes, trying to organize research data in ways that would make sense to minds evolved under different evolutionary pressures while maintaining the precision that his own training demanded. The cellular regeneration samples show anomalous properties when exposed to quantum field fluctuations, he explained to the Valen delegation, gesturing toward microscopic images that represented months of careful analysis. Standard human biochemistry suggests this should be impossible, but your species appears to have developed biological responses to environmental factors that our instruments barely register. Dr. Kiravel Sinthan, the delegation's chief cultural liaison, studied his data with the kind of focused attention that made James acutely aware of the intelligence behind her alien features. Her opalescent skin shifted through subtle color patterns that his cultural briefings had identified as indicating analytical processing, while her silver eyes seemed to perceive layers of meaning in his research that he hadn't consciously intended to include. Your instruments detect quantum fluctuations accurately, she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made even technical discussions sound like carefully composed music. But human scientific methodology interprets such data through frameworks that assume consciousness and reality operate independently of each other. As opposed to Valen methodology, which assumes what exactly? James asked, genuinely curious about scientific approaches that had apparently produced technological capabilities exceeding human achievement despite operating according to completely different theoretical foundations. That consciousness and reality are aspects of the same fundamental phenomenon, Kira replied, her skin color shifting to patterns that suggested she was sharing information usually reserved for advanced theoretical discussions. What you observe as anomalous cellular behavior represents normal biological response to conscious observation itself affecting quantum states at the molecular level. James paused in his data manipulation, processing implications that would require him to reconsider basic assumptions about the relationship between observer and observed that had guided human scientific methodology for centuries. You're suggesting that consciousness directly affects physical reality at the quantum level? We're suggesting that the distinction between consciousness and physical reality is artificial construct that limits understanding rather than enhancing it, Kira corrected, moving closer to his holographic displays with movements that carried both scientific interest and something that might have been personal curiosity about his reactions to concepts that challenged fundamental human assumptions. Their conversation continued through the afternoon shift, ranging across topics that spanned the gap between practical research applications and theoretical frameworks that would reshape both species' understanding of how reality operated at its most fundamental levels. James found himself increasingly impressed by Kira's ability to navigate complex scientific concepts while maintaining awareness of the cultural implications that made such discussions possible between beings whose evolutionary development had followed completely different paths. Your research into biological quantum resonance, he said as their formal session concluded, demonstrates analytical capabilities that exceed anything in human scientific literature. The precision of your theoretical frameworks, the elegance of your experimental design, it's remarkable work. Kira's opalescent skin flickered through color patterns that James's cultural training identified as indicating surprise, though something in her expression suggested his assessment had triggered responses more complex than simple professional satisfaction. Thank you, she replied, her harmonics carrying new undertones that transformed routine courtesy into something that seemed more personal. Human scientific methodology offers perspectives that our approaches often overlook. Your systematic analysis provides frameworks that complement our intuitive understanding in ways that strengthen both approaches. As she gathered her research materials, James found himself studying her features with appreciation that extended beyond mere academic respect into genuine admiration for someone whose intelligence operated through principles he was only beginning to understand. Her silver eyes seemed to hold depths that reflected not just enhanced cognitive capabilities but wisdom that transcended the accumulated knowledge of any individual consciousness. Kira, he said without conscious intention, the words emerging from recognition that felt too profound for professional context, your eyes are beautiful. The response was immediate and profound. Kira's breath caught audibly, her lips parting as though she were about to speak before remaining frozen in expression that mixed surprise with something far deeper. Her opalescent skin began cycling through color patterns that James had never seen before, complex cascades of silver and deep blue that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some internal process that his cultural briefings had provided no framework for interpreting. She began, then stopped, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was experiencing something that transcended normal emotional responses to casual compliments. James felt concern rising as he realized his intended compliment had apparently triggered reactions far more intense than anything he had anticipated. "Kira, I'm sorry if I said something inappropriate. I didn't mean to." "No," she whispered, her silver eyes meeting his with intensity that seemed to create connections between their consciousness that operated below the level of voluntary choice. "Not inappropriate. Just unexpected." Her skin colors continued cycling through patterns that suggested profound internal activity, processes that apparently required her complete attention to navigate successfully. When she looked at him again, her expression carried recognition that seemed to transcend their brief professional relationship into territory that neither had anticipated entering. "I need to." She began, then paused, apparently searching for words that could bridge the gap between whatever she was experiencing and concepts that human language could adequately express. "I need time to process what you've said." "Of course," James replied, though he found himself uncertain about what exactly required processing about a simple aesthetic observation. "Take whatever time you need." Kira gathered her materials with movements that carried new precision, as though his compliment had somehow altered her relationship to physical space and routine activities. When she turned to leave, her final glance toward him carried weight that seemed to transform their entire professional relationship into something neither had names for yet. "James," she said quietly, his name carrying harmonics that made it sound like music composed specifically for his hearing, "thank you for seeing me." After she left, James remained in the laboratory trying to understand what had just occurred between them. His simple compliment about her eyes had apparently triggered responses that extended far beyond normal social interaction into territory that his xenopsychology training had provided no frameworks for navigating. Through the lab's viewports, he could see the vast expanse of space that had brought their species together for the first time in recorded history, stars that had witnessed countless forms of consciousness emerge and develop according to principles that defied easy categorization. Something about his recognition of Kira's beauty had created connections between them that transcended the careful protocols designed to maintain professional distance between species whose approaches to existence operated according to completely different evolutionary principles. As evening shift began and the station settled into its quieter operational rhythms, James found himself wondering whether his compliment had been received as casual social interaction or as something far more significant in Valen cultural context. The intensity of Kira's response suggested that aesthetic recognition carried implications among her people that human social customs had never developed frameworks for understanding. The 3 days that followed James's compliment became an exercise in navigating uncharted emotional territory as Kira maintained her duties with mechanical precision while processing whatever internal experience his words had triggered. She attended research briefings, contributed to theoretical discussions, and participated in cultural exchange sessions with the same professional competence that had marked her work since the delegation's arrival, but she spoke only when direct questions required responses, and never more than absolutely necessary. "She's gone completely silent," Dr. Sarah Martinez observed during their weekly xenopsychology consultation, reviewing behavioral analysis data that painted a picture of someone undergoing profound internal transformation. Not withdrawn exactly, but intensely focused on something that requires all her cognitive resources to process. James studied the holographic displays that tracked Valen emotional indicators through skin color analysis and harmonic voice patterns. Could I have violated some cultural protocol? Maybe aesthetic compliments carry different meanings among her people. More than different meanings, Dr. Martinez replied, accessing files that contained the limited information human researchers had compiled about Valen emotional architecture. According to our cultural anthropology data, Valens experience beauty through neural pathways that create direct connections between aesthetic appreciation and psychological bonding mechanisms. Bonding mechanisms? James asked, though something in his chest tightened with anticipation of answers that would complicate his understanding of what had occurred between them. Their species evolved sensory capabilities that process aesthetic recognition as forms of consciousness mapping, Dr. Martinez explained, manipulating displays that showed theoretical models of alien neural architecture. When Valens encounter what they consider true beauty, their brains undergo restructuring that creates permanent pathways associating that recognition with identity development and social connection. James felt cold certainty settling in his stomach as he grasped the implications of what he had unknowingly triggered. "You're saying that complementing her appearance activated psychological processes that she can't control or reverse?" "I'm saying that your recognition of her beauty was processed through neural architecture that treats aesthetic appreciation as the foundation for the deepest form of interpersonal connection their species is capable of experiencing," Dr. Martinez corrected, her tone carrying the careful precision of someone explaining concepts that human psychology had no equivalent frameworks for understanding. Through the research station's transparent corridors, James could see Kira working in the xenobotany labs, her movements carrying the fluid grace that marked Valen physical coordination but lacking the natural ease that had characterized their earlier interactions. Her opalescent skin displayed steady patterns of deep blue and silver that his growing familiarity with her emotional indicators suggested represented intense concentration on internal processes. "Is she suffering?" he asked, concerned that his innocent compliment had somehow caused psychological distress that he had no framework for addressing or alleviating. "Unknown," Dr. Martinez admitted. Valen emotional processing operates according to principles that our psychological models can't adequately predict. But her color patterns suggest she's experiencing something profound rather than distressing, transformation rather than trauma. James made his way to the xenobotany lab where Kira spent most of her time when not required for formal delegation duties. Her work involved analyzing plant specimens that demonstrated impossible biological properties when exposed to conscious observation, research that apparently validated Valen theories about the relationship between awareness and physical reality. "Kira," he said quietly, not wanting to startle someone whose attention seemed focused on levels of reality that his human perception couldn't access. "Can we talk?" She looked up from the microscopic analysis she'd been conducting, her silver eyes meeting his with intensity that seemed to create direct neural connections between their consciousness despite the obvious differences in their evolutionary development. Her skin colors shifted through patterns that suggested she had been anticipating this conversation. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed specifically for his hearing rather than general communication. "Though I should warn you that I may not be able to explain what has been happening in terms that your cultural framework provides adequate concepts for understanding." "Try me," James said, settling beside her workstation in a position that allowed them to maintain the kind of direct eye contact that Valen cultural protocols apparently considered essential for authentic communication. "When you said my eyes were beautiful," Kira began, her opalescent skin cycling through color patterns that suggested she was accessing memories with perfect clarity, "you triggered neural cascades that my species experiences as recognition of essential rather than superficial beauty." "Essential beauty meaning what exactly?" James asked, though something in her tone suggested the answer would reshape his understanding of aesthetic appreciation in ways that extended far beyond normal social interaction. "Beauty that encompasses the totality of consciousness rather than simply external appearance," she explained, her harmonics carrying depths of meaning that human vocal cords couldn't replicate but that somehow conveyed concepts about recognition that transcended physical observation. "When Valens perceive such beauty, our neural architecture interprets it as confirmation that the observer sees our true nature rather than simply our visible characteristics." James processed her explanation through xenopsychology frameworks that suddenly seemed inadequate for understanding the complexity of what his compliment had meant in the context of her species' approach to consciousness and identity. "So when I said your eyes were beautiful," he said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, "you experienced it as recognition of who you are as an individual rather than simple appreciation of your physical appearance." "More than recognition," Kira corrected, her silver eyes holding his with intensity that seemed to bridge every gap between human and alien approaches to emotional connection. "Confirmation that someone from a completely different evolutionary background could perceive the aspects of my consciousness that I consider most fundamentally representative of my identity." And that triggered changes in your neural architecture that you've been processing for the past 3 days, James realized, grasping why her silence had been necessary for navigating whatever transformation his words had initiated. Changes that are still occurring, she confirmed, her skin colors shifting to patterns that suggested ongoing internal activity. My consciousness is restructuring itself around the recognition that interspecies understanding is possible at levels that our cultural protocols never anticipated. Through the lab's observation windows, they could see other members of both delegations going about their duties with the careful formality that marked first contact protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of personal connection that was apparently developing between them. Kira, James said carefully, recognizing that whatever was happening between them extended far beyond casual professional interaction into territory that neither their species had developed guidelines for navigating. What happens now? Her response came not in words but in color patterns that cycled through spectrums he had never seen before, opalescent skin displaying emotional resonances that suggested she was experiencing something that human language had no adequate terminology for describing. Now, she said quietly, her harmonics carrying certainty that seemed to encompass possibilities that neither of them had consciously considered, we discover what becomes possible when consciousness recognizes itself across evolutionary boundaries that were supposed to make such understanding impossible. As they sat together in the lab surrounded by plant specimens that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between observer and observed, James realized that his simple compliment had initiated something far more significant than aesthetic appreciation. It had opened pathways for connection between minds that had been shaped by completely different evolutionary pressures but apparently shared fundamental principles that transcended the artificial boundaries their respective cultures had drawn between possible and impossible forms of interpersonal understanding. The week that followed their conversation in the xenobotany lab revealed the true scope of transformation that James's recognition had triggered within Kira's consciousness. Her work performance became almost supernatural in precision and insight, as though his acknowledgement of her essential beauty had unlocked cognitive capabilities that had been previously inaccessible to her conscious mind. Her research into consciousness-reality interaction produced theoretical breakthroughs that made both human and Valen scientists reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of observation and physical law. She's operating at cognitive levels that exceed our baseline measurements for her species, Dr. Martinez reported during their daily analysis sessions, reviewing data that painted a picture of someone whose neural architecture had been fundamentally restructured by emotional recognition. Her analytical capabilities have increased by approximately 40% since your compliment triggered whatever process she's been navigating. James studied the holographic displays that tracked Kira's enhanced performance across multiple research parameters. Enhancement through aesthetic recognition. That doesn't match any psychological models in our databases. Because we've never encountered a species whose neural development creates direct pathways between beauty perception and consciousness expansion, Dr. Martinez explained, accessing theoretical frameworks that human xenopsychology was developing in real time to understand phenomena that previous first contact scenarios had never documented. Her brain is literally rebuilding itself around the recognition that someone from another species could perceive her essential nature. Through the research station's observation decks, James could see Kira working with plant specimens that responded to conscious observation by displaying impossible biological properties, flowers that bloomed in patterns that matched the observer's emotional state, trees that grew in mathematical sequences that reflected the complexity of nearby thought processes, ecosystems that seemed to thrive on the kind of focused attention that conscious beings provided simply by existing in their proximity. The botanical specimens she's studying, James realized, understanding beginning to dawn as he processed connections between her research and her personal transformation, they're demonstrating the same consciousness-reality interaction that her neural architecture has been developing since I recognized her beauty. Precisely, Dr. Martinez confirmed. Her enhanced cognitive capabilities are allowing her to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that operate below the level of normal conscious detection. Your recognition didn't just affect her emotionally, it activated latent abilities that her species possesses but rarely accesses without specific triggering conditions. James made his way to the advanced research wing where Kira had been conducting experiments that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical law. Her work area looked like a blend of laboratory and art installation, with scientific instruments arranged around living plants that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythms. "James," she said without looking up from the quantum resonance scanner she was calibrating, her awareness of his presence apparently extending beyond normal sensory detection. "I was hoping you would come. There's something I need to show you." She gestured toward a holographic display that materialized in the air between them, mathematical equations that seemed to move and breathe with organic fluidity despite their precisely calculated parameters. "This represents the consciousness mapping that occurred when you recognized my essential beauty." James studied the equations with growing amazement as he realized he was looking at a real-time analysis of the moment when his compliment had triggered neural cascades that restructured her entire approach to understanding reality. "You've been mathematically modeling your own psychological transformation. I've been tracking the changes in my consciousness architecture to understand how recognition from another species could activate capabilities that my people develop only under extremely specific conditions," she corrected, manipulating the display to show cascading neural patterns that resembled artistic expression more than scientific data. "What kind of conditions?" James asked, though something in her tone suggested the answer would reveal implications that extended far beyond academic curiosity. "When Valens encounter what we call the Velthara, recognition of essential beauty that transcends species barriers," she explained, her opalescent skin displaying color patterns that suggested she was sharing information that her culture considered sacred rather than simply educational. "It activates consciousness capabilities that normally remain dormant throughout our entire lives." The holographic equations shifted to display what appeared to be a real-time map of her current neural state, patterns that pulsed with complexity that exceeded anything in human neurological databases. "Your recognition created pathways in my consciousness that connect aesthetic appreciation directly to reality manipulation at the quantum level." "Reality manipulation," James repeated, understanding flooding through him as he grasped the implications of what she was describing. "The enhanced research capabilities, the impossible botanical specimens, the consciousness-reality interaction you've been studying, it's all connected to what happened when I complimented your eyes. All connected to the moment when someone from another species demonstrated the ability to perceive aspects of my identity that I had never imagined could be visible to consciousness evolved according to different principles," she confirmed, her silver eyes meeting his with intensity that seemed to create direct neural connections between their awareness. She moved closer to the holographic display, her movements carrying new grace that suggested her enhanced consciousness was affecting her relationship to physical space itself. "James, what you triggered in my awareness represents more than personal transformation. It demonstrates that consciousness recognition can transcend evolutionary boundaries that we thought were absolute." "What does that mean for us?" he asked, recognizing that whatever was developing between them extended far beyond professional cooperation into territory that neither species had developed protocols for navigating. "It means," Kira said, her harmonics carrying certainty that seemed to encompass possibilities that neither of them had consciously considered, "that your recognition has created capabilities in my consciousness that can only be fully realized through continued connection with the awareness that triggered their development." James felt something shift in his understanding as he processed the implications of what she was suggesting. "You're saying that the changes in your neural architecture require ongoing interaction with me to maintain their stability?" "I'm saying that the consciousness expansion you triggered represents the beginning of something that my species has theoretical knowledge of but never expected to experience with beings from other evolutionary backgrounds," she replied, her skin colors cycling through patterns that suggested profound anticipation mixed with something that might have been hope. "What kind of something?" James asked, though he suspected the answer would transform both their lives in ways that their respective cultures had no frameworks for understanding. "Partnership that transcends the boundaries between individual consciousness," Kira said quietly, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed to resonate directly with his neural pathways. "Connection that serves the development of awareness itself rather than simply satisfying personal emotional needs." As they stood together surrounded by equipment that demonstrated impossible relationships between consciousness and physical reality, James realized that his simple compliment about her beautiful eyes had initiated processes that would reshape both their understanding of what was possible when minds evolved according to different principles chose to recognize each other's essential nature despite every evolutionary pressure that should have made such recognition impossible. The silence that had marked her response to his compliment was ending, but what was beginning between them would require both of them to learn entirely new forms of communication that could bridge the gap between human and Valen approaches to consciousness, beauty, and the kind of connection that apparently transcended every boundary except the ones individuals chose to maintain through willful blindness to their shared potential for understanding that operated below the level of cultural conditioning. The resolution came during New Horizons' quiet shift, when most of both delegations had retired to their quarters and the research station settled into the gentle rhythms that marked humanity's first successful extended cooperation with an alien species. James found himself in the observation lounge, studying star charts that represented the vast distances their peoples had traveled to achieve this unprecedented meeting of minds evolved according to completely different evolutionary principles. "I was hoping to find you here." Kira's voice carried harmonics that seemed designed specifically for his hearing, transformed through the consciousness enhancement that his recognition had triggered into communication that operated on frequencies human neural architecture shouldn't have been able to process. She approached with movements that carried new confidence, her opalescent skin displaying color patterns that his growing familiarity with Valen emotional expression allowed him to interpret as profound gratitude mixed with something deeper that human language didn't have adequate terminology for describing. "Kira," James said, turning from the star charts to give her his full attention, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding consciousness partnership that transcends individual boundaries. I'm not sure I understand what you're offering, or whether I'm capable of the kind of connection you're describing." "Understanding will develop through experience rather than explanation," she replied, settling beside him in a position that allowed them to maintain the kind of direct eye contact that Valen cultural protocols considered essential for authentic communication. "But first, I need to share something about my species that your cultural briefings didn't include." She activated a holographic display that materialized between them, showing what appeared to be historical records from Valen civilization spanning thousands of years. "My people have theoretical knowledge of consciousness bonds that can form between individuals from different species, but we had never encountered another form of awareness sophisticated enough to trigger such connections." "Consciousness bonds," James repeated, studying the historical data that painted pictures of Valen individuals whose neural architecture had been transformed through recognition from beings whose evolutionary development had followed parallel rather than divergent paths. "Partnerships that create permanent pathways between individual awareness, allowing consciousness to expand beyond the limitations of single-species perspective," Kira explained, her harmonics carrying depths of meaning that suggested she was sharing information her culture considered sacred rather than simply educational. The holographic records showed Valens whose enhanced capabilities had reshaped their entire civilization's approach to understanding reality, individuals whose consciousness bonds with compatible awareness had created technological and philosophical breakthroughs that transcended anything either species could have achieved independently. These historical examples, James observed, noting patterns that suggested such bonds were rare but profoundly significant when they occurred, they all involved connections between Valens and beings whose neural architecture was similar enough to create stable pathways. "Until now," Kira confirmed, her silver eyes meeting his with intensity that seemed to create direct connections between their consciousness despite the obvious differences in their evolutionary development. "Your recognition of my essential beauty activated compatibility protocols that my people had never detected in species evolved according to principles as different from ours as human neural architecture represents." She moved closer, her presence seeming to affect the very air around them in ways that made normal physical laws feel negotiable. "James, what I experienced when you said my eyes were beautiful wasn't just aesthetic appreciation, it was confirmation that consciousness itself operates according to principles that transcend the boundaries our respective cultures have drawn between possible and impossible forms of connection." And the silence that followed, he said, understanding beginning to dawn as he grasped the scope of what she had been processing during the days when she had seemed withdrawn from normal interaction, was necessary preparation for offering me something that neither of our species had frameworks for understanding. "Exactly," she confirmed, her opalescent skin cycling through color patterns that suggested she was accessing the deepest levels of her cultural and personal identity. "I needed time to restructure my consciousness around the recognition that interspecies bonding was not only possible but necessary for both our awareness to reach their full potential." Kira stood and moved to the observation lounge's central space, her movements carrying ceremonial significance that suggested she was about to formalize whatever had been developing between them since his compliment had triggered her transformation. In Valen culture, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the station's structure itself, when someone offers consciousness bonding, they do so through demonstration rather than mere explanation. She extended her hands toward him, palms upward in a gesture that his xenocultural training identified as invitation rather than command. When James placed his hands in hers, the contact created immediate neural resonance that allowed him to experience fragments of her consciousness directly, her memories of the moment when his compliment had shattered every assumption she had made about the boundaries between species, her growing understanding that human awareness possessed capabilities that complemented rather than competed with Valen consciousness expansion, and most significantly, her genuine love for someone who had seen her essential nature rather than simply her alien appearance. "What I'm offering you," she said, her words carrying through neural pathways that connected their consciousness directly rather than relying purely on auditory communication, is partnership that serves the development of awareness itself, connection that transcends human and Valen concepts of relationship to create new forms of understanding that neither species could achieve alone. James felt the profound sincerity behind her offer through neural connections that made deception impossible, experiencing her emotional state as directly as his own feelings while maintaining individual identity that had been enhanced rather than subsumed by their connection. "I accept," he said, understanding flowing through pathways that bridged every gap between human creativity and Valen analytical precision, whatever this becomes, whatever responsibilities it creates, whatever changes it requires in both our lives. When Kira smiled, her expression created resonance patterns that seemed to transform the very atmosphere around them, joy that transcended individual satisfaction to encompass shared recognition that consciousness itself had found new ways to connect across evolutionary boundaries that should have made such understanding impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carrying harmonics that created permanent neural pathways connecting their awareness at levels deeper than normal social interaction, "for seeing beauty that I didn't know could be visible to consciousness evolved according to principles so different from my own." "Thank you," James replied, feeling their bond settling into stable configuration that would allow them to share experiences while maintaining individual identity, "for showing me that recognition can create connections that transcend every barrier except the ones we choose to maintain through willful blindness to our shared potential." Through the lounge's transparent walls, they could see stars that had witnessed countless forms of consciousness emerge and develop according to principles that defied easy categorization, indifferent to the small dramas of individual beings yet somehow complicit in the cosmic forces that brought minds together across impossible distances. Their bond would challenge assumptions about the boundaries between species while creating new possibilities for cooperation that served consciousness development rather than simply political convenience. The silence that had followed his compliment about her beautiful eyes had ended, but what was beginning between them would require both species to expand their understanding of what became possible when individuals chose recognition over fear, connection over separation, and love over the artificial boundaries that evolution and culture had erected between forms of awareness that were meant to enhance each other rather than compete for dominance in a universe vast enough to accommodate every form of consciousness that chose cooperation over conquest.